Chapter 19 of Galactic Patrol by E. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 19. It had taken the Lensmen a long time to work out in his mind exactly what it was he had wanted from the Arisians, and from no single source had the basic idea come. Part of it had come from his own knowledge of ordinary hypnosis, part from the ability of the overlords of Delgon to control from a distance the minds of others, part from Warsaw, who, working through Kinnison's own mind, had done such surprising things with the lens, and a great part indeed from the Arisians themselves, who had the astounding ability, literally and completely, to superimpose their own mentalities upon those of others, wherever situate. Part by part and bit by bit the Tellurian Lensman had built up his plan, but he had not had the sheer power of intellect to make it work. Now he had that, and was ready to go. Where? His first impulse was to return to Aldebaran I, and to invade again the stronghold of the wheelmen, who had routed him so ignominiously in his one encounter with them. Ordinary prudence, however, counseled against that course. "You better lay off them a while, Kimball, boy," he told himself quite frankly. "They've got a lot of jets, and you don't know how to use this new stuff of yours yet. Better pick out something easier to take." Ever since leaving Arisia, he'd been subconsciously aware of a difference in his eyesight. He was seeing things much more clearly than he had ever seen them before, more sharply and in greater detail. Now this awareness crept into his consciousness, and he glanced toward his tube lights. They were out, except for the tiny lamps and bullseyes of his instrument board. The vessel must be in complete darkness. He remembered then with a shock that when he entered the speedster he had not turned on his lights. He could see, and had not thought of them at all. This, then, was the first of the surprises the Arisian had promised him. He now had the sense of perception of the Rigelians, or was it that of the wheelmen, or both, or were they the same sense? Intently aware now, he focused his attention upon a meter before him. First upon its dial, noting that the needle was exactly upon the green hairline of normal operation. Then deeper. Instantly the face of the instrument disappeared, moved beyond his point of sight, or so it seemed, so that he could see its coils, pivots, and other interior parts. He could look into and study the grain and particle size of the dense, hard condensate of the board itself. His vision was limited, apparently, only by his will to see. "Well, ain't that something?" he demanded of the universe at large. Then, as a thought struck him, "I wonder if they blinded me in the process." He switched on his lamps, discovering that his vision was unimpaired and normal in every respect, and a rigid investigation proved to him conclusively that in addition to ordinary vision he now had an extra sense, or perhaps two of them, and that he could change from one to the other, or use them simultaneously at will. But the very fact of this discovery made Kinnison pause. He hadn't better go anywhere or do anything until he had found out something about his new equipment. The fact was that he didn't even know what he had, to say nothing of knowing how to use it. If he had the sense of a hoot owl, he would go somewhere where he could do a little experimenting without getting his jets burned off, in case something slipped at a critical moment. Where was the nearest patrol base? A big one, fully defended. Let's see. Radalix would be about the closest sector base, he guessed. He'd find out if he could raid that outfit without getting caught at it. Off he shot, and in due course a fair, green, Earth-like planet lay between his vessel's keel. Since it was Earth-like in climate, age, atmosphere, and mass, its people were, of course, more or less similar to humanity in general characteristics, both of body and of mind. If anything, they were even more intelligent than Earthlings, and their patrol base was a very strong one indeed. His spy ray would be useless, since all patrol bases were screened thoroughly and continuously. He would see what a sense of perception would do. From Tragonsky's explanation, it ought to work at this range. It did. When Kinnison concentrated his attention upon the base, he saw it. He advanced toward it at the speed of thought and entered it, passing through screens and metal walls without hindrance, and without giving alarm. He saw men at their accustomed tasks and heard, or rather sensed, their conversation, the everyday chat of their professions. A thrill shot through him at a dazzling possibility thus revealed. If he could make one of these fellows down there do something without his knowing that he was doing it, The problem was solved. That computer, say, make him uncover that calculator and set up a certain integral on it. It would be easy enough to get into touch with him and have him do it, but this was something altogether different. Kinnison got into the computer's mind easily enough, and willed intensely what he was to do, but the officer did not do it. He got up, then, staring about him in bewilderment, sat down again. "What's the matter?" asked one of his fellows. "Forget something?" "Not exactly." The computer still stared. "I was going to set up an integral. I didn't want it either. I could swear that somebody told me to set it up." "Nobody did," grunted the other. "And you'd better start staying home nights. Then maybe you wouldn't get funny ideas." This wasn't so good, Kinnison reflected. The guy should have done it and shouldn't have remembered a thing about it. Well, he hadn't really thought he could put it across at that distance anyway. He didn't have the brain of an Arisian. He'd have to follow his original plan of close-up work. Waiting until the base was well into the night side of the planet, and making sure that his flare baffles were in place, he allowed the speedster to drop downward, landing at some little distance from the fortress. There he left the ship and made his way toward his objective, in a rapid series of long, inertialess hops. Lower and shorter became the hops. Then he cut off his power entirely, and walked until he saw before him, rising from the ground and stretching interminably upward, an almost invisibly shimmering web of force. This, the prowler knew, was the curtain which marked the border of the reservation, the trigger upon which a touch, either of solid object or of beam, would liberate a veritable infernal of the most destructive agencies generable. To the eye that base was not impressive, being merely a few square miles of level ground, outlined with low, broad pillboxes, and studded here and there with harmless-looking, bulging domes. There were a few clusters of buildings. That was all to the eye, but Kinnison was not deceived. He knew that the base itself was 1,000 feet underground, that the pillboxes housed lookouts and detectors, and that those domes were simply weather shields, which, rolled back, would expose projectors second in power not even to those of Prime Base itself. Far to the right, between two tall pylons of metal, was the gate, the only opening in the web. Kinnison had avoided it purposely. It was no part of his plan to subject himself yet to the scrutiny of the all-inclusive photocells of that entrance. Instead, with his new sense of perception, he sought out the conduits leading to those cells and traced them down, through concrete and steel and masonry, to the control room far below. He then superimposed his mind upon that of the man at the board, and flew boldly toward the entrance. He now actually had a dual personality, since one part of his mind was in his body, darting through the air toward the portal, while the other part was deep in the base below, watching him come and acknowledging his signals. A trap lifted, revealing a sloping tunneled ramp, down which the Lensmen shot. He soon found a convenient storeroom. Slipping within it, he withdrew his control carefully from the mind of the observer, wiping out all traces of that control as he did so. He then watched apprehensively for a possible reaction. He was almost sure that he had performed the operation correctly, but he had to be absolutely certain. More than his life depended upon the outcome of this test. The observer, however, remained calm and placid at his post, and a close reading of his thoughts showed that he had not the faintest suspicion that anything untoward had occurred. One more test and he was through. He must find out how many minds he could control simultaneously, but he'd better do that openly. No use making a man feel like a fool needlessly. He'd done that once already, and once was too many times. Therefore, reversing the procedure by which he had come, he went back to his speedster, took her out into the ether, and slept. Then, when the light of morning flooded the base, he cut his detector nullifier and approached it boldly. "Radalex Base, Lensman Kinnison of Tellus asking permission to land. I wish to confer with your Lensman. My screens are down." A spy ray swept through the speedster, the web disappeared, and Kinnison landed, to be greeted by 4 fellow Lensmen with a quiet and cordial respect. Cordiality for his lens and respect for his gray. The base commander knew that his visitor was not there purely for pleasure. Gray Lensmen did not take pleasure jaunts. Therefore, he led the way into his private office and shielded it. "My announcement was not at all informative," Kinnison admitted then. But my errand is nothing to be advertised. I've got to try out something, and I want to ask you 4 Lensmen to cooperate with me for a few minutes." "You need not ask," began the commander. "No, this is not an order at all, simply a request. You see, I've been working a long time on a mind controller, and I want to see if it works. I'll put 4 books on this table, one in front of each of you. Now, I would like to try to make 2 or 3 of you, all 4 of you if I can. Each bend over, pick up his book, and hold it. Your part of the game will be for each of you to try not to pick it up, and to put it back as soon as you possibly can if I do make you obey. Will you?" "Sure," the 3 of them chorused. "There will be no mental damage, of course?" asked the commander. "None whatever, and no after effects. I've had it worked on myself a lot. Do you want any apparatus?" "No, I have everything necessary. Remember, I want top resistance." "Let her come. You'll get plenty of resistance. If you can make any one of us pick up a book after all this warning, I'll say you've got something." Lensman after Lensman, in spite of strainingly resisting mind and body, lifted his book from the table, only to drop it again as Kinnison's control relaxed for an instant. He could control 2 of them, any 2 of them, but he could not quite handle 3. Satisfied, he ceased his efforts. As the base commander poured long cold drinks for the sweating 5, one of his fellows asked, "What did you do, anyway, Kinnison?" "Oh, pardon me, I shouldn't have asked." "Sorry," the Tellurian replied uncomfortably, "but it isn't ready yet. You'll all know about it as soon as possible, but not just now." "Sure," the Red Jellian replied. "I knew I shouldn't have blasted off as soon as I spoke." "Well, thanks a lot, fellows." Kinnison set his empty glass down with a click. "I can make a nice progress report on this dojig now. And one more thing. I did a little long-range experimenting on one of your computers last night." "Desk 12? The one who thought he wanted to integrate something?" "That's the one. Tell him I was using him for a mind ray subject, will you? And give him this 50-credit bill. Don't want the boys needling him too much." "Yes, and thanks. And I wonder..." The base commander evidently had something on his mind. "Say, can you make a man tell the truth with that? And if you can, will you?" "I think so. Certainly I will if I can. Why?" Kinnison knew that he could do so, but he did not wish to seem cocksure. "There's been a murder." The other 3 glanced at each other in understanding, and sighed with profound relief. "A particularly fiendish murder of a girl rather. 2 men have been accused. Each has a perfect alibi, supported by honest witnesses. But you know how much an alibi means now. Both men tell perfectly straight stories under the lens and all other lie detectors. Either one of those men is lying with a polish I would have never believed possible, or both are innocent. And one of them must be guilty. These are the only suspects. If we try them now, we make fools of ourselves, and we can't put off the trial very much longer without losing face. If you can help us out, you'll be doing a lot for the patrol throughout this whole sector." "I can help you," Kinnison declared. "For this, though, better have some props. Make me a box, double Burbank controls, with 5 baby spots on it. Orange, blue, green, purple, and red. I want the biggest set of headphones you've got, and a thick black blindfold. How soon can you try 'em?" "The sooner the better. It can be arranged for this afternoon." The trial was announced, and long before the appointed hour the great courtroom of that world's largest city was thronged. The hour struck. Quiet reigned. Kinnison, the Lensman, in somber gray, strode to the judge's desk and sat down behind the peculiar box upon it. In dead silence 2 other Lensmen approached. The first invested him reverently with the headphones. The second so enwrapped his head in black cloth that it was apparent to all observers that his vision was completely obscured. "Although from a world far distant in space, I have been asked to try 2 suspects for the crime of murder," Kinnison intoned. "I do not know the details of the crime, nor the identity of the suspects. I do know that they and their witnesses are within these railings. I shall now select those who are about to be examined." Piercing beams of intense, vari-colored light played over the 2 groups, and the deep, impressive voice went on. "I know now who the suspects are. They are about to rise, to walk, and to seat themselves as I shall direct." They did so, it being plainly evident to all observers that they were under some awful compulsion. The witnesses may be excused. Truth is the only thing of importance here, and witnesses, being human and therefore frail, obstruct truth more frequently than they further its progress. I shall now examine those two accused. Again the vivid, weirdly distorting glares of light lashed out, bathing in intense monochrome and in various ghastly combinations, first one prisoner, then the other. The while Kinnison drove his mind into theirs, plumbing their deepest depths. The silence, already profound, became the utter stillness of outer space, as the throng, holding its very breath now, sat enthralled by that portentous examination. I have examined them fully. You are all aware that any Lensman of the Galactic Patrol may, in case of need, serve as judge, jury, and executioner. I am, however, none of these, nor is this proceeding to be a trial as you may have understood the term. I have said that witnesses are superfluous. I will now add that neither judge nor jury is necessary. All that is required is to discover the truth, since truth is all-powerful. For that reason also, not even an executioner is needed here. The discovered truth will in and of itself serve us in that capacity. One of these men is guilty, the other is innocent. From the mind of the guilty one I am about to construct a composite, not of this one fiendish crime alone, but of all the crimes he has ever committed. I shall project that composite into the air before him. No innocent mind will be able to see any iota of it. The guilty man, however, will perceive its every revolting detail, and so perceiving, he will forthwith cease to exist in this plane of life. One of the men had nothing to fear. Kinnison had told him so long since. The other had been trembling for minutes in uncontrollable paroxysms of terror. Now this one leaped from his seat, clawing savagely at his eyes and screaming in mad abandon. "I did it! Help! Mercy! Take her away! Oh!" He shrieked and died horribly even as he shrieked. Nor was there noise in the courtroom after the thing was over. The stunned spectators slunk away, scarcely daring even to breathe until they were safely outside. Nor were the Ragellian Lensmen much more at ease. Not a word was said until the five were back in the commander's office at base. Then Kinnison, still white of face and set of jaw, spoke. The others knew that he had found the guilty man, and that he had in some peculiarly terrible fashion executed him. He knew that they knew that the man was hideously guilty. Nevertheless, the Tellurian said, "He was guilty. Guilty as all the devils and all the hells of the entire universe. I never had to do that before, and it gripes me, but I couldn't shove the job off onto you fellows. I wouldn't want anybody to see that picture who didn't have to, and without it you could never begin to understand how atrociously and damnably guilty that hellhound really was." "Thanks, Kinnison," the commander said simply. Kinnison of Tellus. I'll remember that name, in case we ever need you as badly again. But after what you just did, it will be a long time, if ever. You didn't know, did you, that all the inhabitants of 4 planets were watching you?" "Holy rockets, no! Were they?" "They were. And if the way you scared me is any criterion, it will be a long, cold day before anything like that comes up again in this system. And thanks again, Grey Lensman. You have done something for our whole patrol this day. Be sure to dismantle that box so thoroughly that nobody will recognize any of its component parts." Kinnison managed a rather feeble grin. "One more thing and I'll buzz along. Do you fellows happen to know where there's a good, strong pirate base around here anywhere? And while I don't want to seem fussy, I would like it all the better if they were warm-blooded oxygen breathers, so that I won't have to wear armor all the time." "What are you trying to do, give us the needle or something?" That is not precisely what the Ragellian said, but it conveys the thought Kinnison received as the base commander stared at him in amazement. "Don't tell me there is such a base around here," exclaimed the Tellurian in delight. "Is there, really?" There is. It is so strong that we've not been able to touch it, and it is manned and staffed by natives of your own planet, Tellus of Sol. We reported it to Prime Base some 83 days ago, just after we discovered it. You're direct from there." He fell silent. This was no way to be talking to a Grey Lensman. "I was in the hospital then, fighting with my nurse because she wouldn't give me anything to eat," Kinnison explained with a laugh. "When I left Tellus, I didn't check up on the late data. Didn't think I would need it quite so soon. If you got it, though." "Hospital? You?" queried one of the younger Lensmen. "Yeah, bit off more than I could chew." And the Tellurian briefly described his misadventure with the wheelman of Aldebaran 1. "This other thing has come up since then, though, and I won't be sticking my neck out that way again. If you've got such a made-to-order base as that in this region, it'll save me a long trip. Where is it?" They gave him its coordinates and what little information they'd been able to secure concerning it. They did not ask him why he wanted that data. They may have wondered at his temerity in daring to scout alone a fortress whose strength had kept at bay the massed patrol forces of the sector, but if they did so, they kept their thoughts well screened. For this was a Grey Lensman, and very evidently a superpowered individual, even of that select group whose weakest members were powerful indeed. If he felt like talking, they would listen. But Kinnison did not talk. He did the listening. Then, when he had learned everything they knew of the Boskonian base, he said, "Well, I'd better be buzzing. Clear ether, fellows." And he was gone. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20 of Galactic Patrol by E. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. Out from Radalix and into deep space shot the speedster, bearing the Grey Lensman toward Boisia 2, where the Boskonian base was situated. The patrol forces had not even yet been able to locate it definitely, therefore it must be cleverly hidden indeed. It was manned and staffed by Tellurians, and this was fairly close to the line first taken by the pilot of the pirate vessel, whose crew had been so decimated by Van Buskirk and his Valerians. There couldn't be so many Boskonian bases with Tellurian personnel, Kinnison reflected. It was well within the bounds of possibility, even of probability, that he might again encounter here his former but unsuspecting shipmates. Since the Boisian system was less than 100 parsecs from Radalix, a couple of hours found the Lensmen staring down upon another green and earthly world. Very earthly indeed was this one. There were polar ice caps, areas of intensely dazzling white. There was an atmosphere, deep and sweetly blue, filled for the most part with sunlight, but flecked here and there with clouds, some of which were slow-moving storms. There were continents, bearing mountains and plains, lakes and rivers. There were oceans, studded with islands great and small. But Kinnison was no planetographer, nor had he been gone from Tellus sufficiently long, so that the sight of this beautiful and homelike world aroused in him any qualm of nostalgia. He was looking for a pirate base, and dropping his speedster as low into the night side as he dared, he began his search. Of man or of the works of man he at first found little enough trace. All human or pseudo-human life was apparently still in a savage state of development, and except for a few scattered races, or rather tribes, of burrowers and of cliff or cave dwellers, it was still nomadic, wandering here and there without permanent habitation or structure. Animals of scores of genera and species were there in myriads. But neither was Kinnison a biologist. He wanted pirates, and it seemed that was the one form of life which he was not going to find. But finally, through sheer grim bulldog pertinacity, he was successful. That base was there, somewhere. He would find it, no matter how long it took. He would find it if he had to examine the entire crust of the planet, land and water alike, kilometer by plotted cubic kilometer. He set out to do just that, and it was thus that he found the Boskonian stronghold. It had been built directly beneath a towering range of mountains, protected from detection by mile upon mile of native copper and of iron ore. Its entrances, invisible before, were even now not readily perceptible, camouflaged as they were by outer layers of rock, which matched exactly in form, color, and texture the rocks of the cliffs in which they were placed. Once those entrances were located, the rest was easy. Again he set his speedster into a carefully observed orbit, and came to ground in his armor. Again he crept forward, furtively and skulkingly, until he could perceive a shimmering web of force. With minor variations, his method of entry into the Boskonian base was similar to that he had used in making his way into the patrol base upon Radalix. He was, however, working now with a surety and a precision which had then been entirely lacking. His practice upon the patrolmen and his terrific bout with the 4 Lensmen had given him knowledge and technique. His sitting and judgment, during which he had touched almost every mind in the vast assemblage, had taught him much. And above all, the grisly finale of that sitting, horribly distasteful and soul-racking as it had been, had given him training of inestimable value, necessitating as it had the infliction of the ultimate penalty. He knew that he might have to stay inside that base for some time. Therefore he selected his hiding place with care. He could, of course, blank out the knowledge of his presence in the mind of anyone chancing to discover him, but since such an interruption might come at a critical instant, he preferred to take up his residence in a secluded place. There were, of course, many vacant suites in the officers' quarters. All bases must have accommodations for visitors, and the Lensman decided to occupy one of them. It was a simple matter to obtain a key, and inside the bare but comfortable little room, he stripped off his armor with a sigh of relief. Leaning back in a deeply upholstered leather armchair, he closed his eyes and let his sense of perception roam throughout the great establishment. With all of his newly developed power he studied it, hour after hour and day after day. When he was hungry, the pirate cooks fed him, not knowing that they did so. He had lived on iron rations long enough. When he was tired, he slept, with his eternally vigilant Lens on guard. Finally, he knew everything there was to be known about that stronghold, and was ready to act. He did not take over the mind of the base commander, but chose instead the chief communications officer, as the one most likely and most intimately to have dealings with Helmuth. For Helmuth, he who spoke for Boskoni, had for many long months been the Lensman's definite objective. But this game could not be hurried. Bases, no matter how important, did not call Grand Base, except upon matters of the most dire urgency, and no such matter eventuated. Nor did Helmuth call that base, since nothing out of the ordinary was happening, to any pirate's knowledge, that is, and his attention was more necessary elsewhere. One day, however, there came crackling in a triumphant report. A ship working out of that base had taken noble booty indeed, no less a prize than a fully supplied hospital ship of the patrol itself. As the report progressed, Kinnison's heart went down into his boots, and he swore bitterly to himself. How in all the 9 hells of Valeria had they managed to take such a ship as that? Hadn't she been escorted? Nevertheless, as chief communications officer, he took the report and congratulated heartily, through the ship's radio man, its captain, its officers, and its crew. "Mighty fine work. Helmuth himself shall hear of this," he concluded his words of praise. "How'd you do it, with one of the new maulers?" "Yes, sir," came the reply. "Our mauler, accompanying us just out of range, came up and engaged theirs. That left us free to take this ship. We locked on with magnets, cut our way in, and here we are." There they were indeed. The hospital ship was red with blood. Patients, doctors, interns, officers, and operating crew alike had been butchered with the horribly ruthless savagery, which was the customary technique of all the agencies of Boskoni. Of all that ship's personnel, only the nurses lived. They were not to be put to death, yet, in fact, and under certain conditions, they need not die at all. They huddled together, a little knot of white-clad misery in that corpse-littered room, and even now one of them was being dragged away. She was fighting viciously, with fists and feet, with nails and teeth. No one pirate could handle her. It took 2 of the huskies to subdue that struggling fury. They hauled her upright, and she threw back her head in panting defiance. There was a cascade of red bronze hair, and Kinnison saw Clarissa McDougal. He remembered that there had been some talk that they were going to put her back into space service. The Lensman decided instantly what to do. "Stop, you swine!" he roared through his pirate mouthpiece. "Where do you think you're going with that nurse?" To the captain's cabin, sir." The huskies stopped short in amazement as that roar filled the room, but answered the question concisely. "Let her go." Then, as the girl fled back to the huddled group in the corner, he said, "Tell the captain to come out here, and assemble every officer and man of the crew. I want to talk to everybody at once." He had a minute or two in which to think, and he thought furiously but accurately. He had to do something, but whatever he did must be done strictly according to the pirate's own standards of ethics. If he made one slip, it might be Aldebaran one all over again. He knew how to keep from making that slip, he thought. But also, and this was the hard part, he must work in something that would let those nurses know that there was still hope, that there were a few more acts of this drama yet to come. Otherwise, he knew with a stark cold certainty what would happen. He knew of what stuff the space nurses of the patrol were made, knew that they could be driven just so far and no further alive. There was a way out of that, too. In the childishness of his hospitalization, he had called Nurse McDougal a dumbbell. He had thought of her, and had spoken to her quite frankly, in uncomplimentary terms. But he knew that there was a real brain back of that beautiful countenance, that a quick and keen intelligence resided under that red bronze thatch. Therefore, when the assembly was complete, he was ready, and in no uncertain or ambiguous language he opened up. "Listen, you, all of you," he barked savagely. "This is the first time in months that we've made such a haul as this, and you fellows have the brazen gall to start helping yourself to the choicest stuff before anybody else gets a look at it. I tell you now to lay off. And that goes exactly as it lays. I, personally, will kill any man that touches any one of those women before they arrive here at base. Now you, Captain, are the first and worst offender of the lot." And he stared directly into the eyes of the officer, whom he had last seen entering the dungeon of the wheelman. "I admit that you're a good picker." Kinnison's voice was now venomously soft, his intonation distinct, with thinly veiled sarcasm. "Unfortunately, however, your taste agrees too well with mine. You see, Captain, I'm going to need a nurse myself. I think I'm coming down with something. And since I've got to have a nurse, I'll take that red-headed one. I had a nurse once with hair just that color, who insisted on feeding me tea and toast and a soft-boiled egg when I wanted beefsteak. And I'm going to take my grudge out on this one here, for all the red-headed nurses that ever lived. I trust that you will pardon the length of this speech, but I want to give you my reasons in full for cautioning you that this particular nurse is my own particular personal property. Mark her for me, and see to it that she gets here, exactly as she is now." The captain had been afraid to interrupt his superior, but now he erupted. "But see here, Blakesley," he stormed, "she ought to be mine by every right. I captured her. I saw her first. I've got her here." "Enough of that back talk, Captain," Kinnison sneered elaborately. "You know, of course, that you are violating every rule by taking booty for yourself before division at base, and that you can be shot for doing it." "But everybody does it," protested the captain. "Except when a superior officer catches him at it. Superiors get first pick, you know." The Lensman reminded him, suavely. "But I protest, sir. I'll take it up with—" "Shut up!" Kinnison snarled with cold finality. "Take it up with whom you please. But remember this, my last warning. Bring her in to me as she is and you live. Touch her and you die. Now, you nurses, come over here to the board." Nurse McDougal had been whispering furtively to the others, and now she led the way, head high and eyes blazing defiance. She was an actress as well as a nurse. "Take a good long look at this button, right here, marked Relay 46, came curt instructions. "If anybody aboard this ship touches any one of you, or even looks at you as though he wants to, press this button and I'll do the rest. Now, you big red-headed dumbbell, look at me. Don't start begging yet. I just want to be sure that you'll know me when you see me." "I'll know you. Never fear, you brat," she flared, thus informing the Lensman that she had received his message. "I'll not only know you, I'll scratch your eyes out on sight." "That'll be a good trick if you can do it," Kinnison sneered and cut off. "What's it all about, Mac? What has got into you?" demanded one of the nurses, as soon as the women were alone. "I don't know," she whispered. "Watch out. They may have spy rays on us. I don't know anything, really. and the whole thing is too wildly impossible, too utterly fantastic to be even partially true. But pass the word along to all the girls to ride this out, because my gray Lensman is in on it, somewhere and somehow. I don't see how he can be, possibly, but I just know that he is. For at the first mention of tea and toast, before she perceived even an inkling of the true situation, her mind had flashed back instantly to Kinnison, the most stubborn and rebellious patient she had ever had. More, the only man she had ever known who had treated her precisely as though she were a part of the hospital's very furniture. As is the way of women, particularly of beautiful women, she had orated of women's rights and of women's status in the scheme of things. She had decried all special privileges, and had stated, often and with heat, that she asked no odds of any man living or yet to be born. Nevertheless, and also beautiful woman-like, the thought had bitten deep that here was a man who had never even realized that she was a woman, to say nothing of realizing that she was an extraordinarily beautiful one, and deep within her and sternly suppressed the thought had still rankled. At the mention of beefsteaks she all but screamed, gripping her knees with frantic hands to keep her emotion down. For she had had no real hope. She was simply fighting with everything she had until the hopeless end, which she had known could not long be delayed. Now she gathered herself together and began to act. When the word dumbbell boomed from the speaker, she knew, beyond doubt or peradventure, that it was Kinnison, the gray Lensman, who was really doing that talking. It was crazy. It didn't make any kind of sense at all. But it was. It must be true. And again, womanlike, she knew with the calm certainty that as long as the gray Lensman were alive and conscious, he would be completely the master of any situation in which he might find himself. Therefore she passed along her illogical but cheering thought, and the nurses, also being women, accepted it without question as the actual and accomplished fact. They carried on, and when the captured hospital ship had docked at base, Kinnison was completely ready to force matters to a conclusion. In addition to the chief communications officer, he now had under his control a highly capable observer. To handle two such minds was child's play to the intellect, which had directed against their full fighting wills the minds of 2 3/4 alert, powerful, and fully worn Lensmen. "Good girl, Mac." He put his mind on rapport with hers and sent his message. "Glad you got the idea. You did a good job of acting, and if you can do some more as good, we'll be all set. Can do?" "I'll say I can," she assented fervently. "I don't know what you're doing, how you can possibly do it, or where you are, but that can wait. Tell me what to do and I'll do it." "Make a pass at the base commander," he instructed her. "Hate me, the ape I'm working through, you know. All over the place. Get into it big. You maybe could love him, but if I get you, you'll blow out your brains, if any. You know the line. Play up to him with everything you can bring to bear, and hate me all to pieces. Help all you can to start a fight between us. If he falls for you hard enough, the blow-off comes then and there. If not, he'll be able to do us all plenty of dirt. I can kill a lot of them, but not enough of them quick enough." "He'll fall," she promised him gleefully, "like 10,000 bricks falling down a well. Just watch my jets." And fall he did. He had not even seen a woman for months, and he expected nothing except bitter resistance and suicide from any of these women of the patrol. Therefore he was rocked to the heels, set back upon his very haunches, when the most beautiful woman he had ever seen came of her own volition into his arms, seeking in them sanctuary from his own chief communications officer. "I hate him," she sobbed, nestling against the huge bulk of the base commander's body, and turning upon him the full blast of the high-powered projectors which were her eyes. "You wouldn't be so mean to me. I just know you wouldn't." And her subtly perfumed head sank upon his shoulder. The base commander was just so much soft wax. "I'll say I wouldn't be mean to you." His voice dropped to a gentle bellow. "Why, you little sweetheart, I'll marry you. I will, by all the gods of space." It thus came about that nurse and base commander entered the control room together, arms about each other. "There he is," she shrieked, pointing at the chief communications officer. "He's the one. Now let's see you start something, you rat-faced clunker. There's one real man around here, and he won't let you touch me. Yah!" She gave him a resounding Bronx cheer, and her escort swelled visibly. "Is that so?" Kinnison sneered. "Get this, baby face, and get it straight. You were marked as mine as soon as I looked the ship over, and mine you're going to be, whether you like it or not, and no matter what anybody else says or does about it. And as for you, Chief, you're too late. I saw her first. And now, you red-headed hussy, come over here where you belong." She snuggled closer into the commander's embrace, and the big man turned purple. "What do you mean, too late?" he roared. "You took her away from the ship's captain, didn't you? You said that superior officers get first choice, and they do. I'm the boss here, and I'm taking her away from you. Get me? You'll stand for it, too, yes, and you'll like it. One word out of you, and I'll have you spread-eagled across the mouth of number 6 projector. Superior officers do not always get first choice," Kinnison replied, with bitter cold ferocity, but choosing his words with care. "It depends entirely upon who the 2 men are." Now was the time to strike. Kinnison knew that if the base commander kept his head, the lives of those valiant women were forfeit, and the Lensmen's whole plan seriously endangered. He himself could get away, of course, but he could not see himself doing it under these conditions. No, he must goad the commander to a frenzy. Mac would help. In fact, and without his suggestion, she was even then hard at work fomenting trouble between the 2 men. "You don't have to take that from anybody, big boy," she was whispering urgently. "Don't call in a crew to spread eagle him either. Beam him out yourself. You're a better man than he is any time. Blast him down. That'll show him who's who around this base. When the inferior is such a man as I am, and the superior is such one as you are," the biting, contemptuously sneering voice went on, without a break. "Such a bloated swine, such a mangy low-down cur, such a pussy-gutted tub of lard, such a worthless, brainless spawn of the lowest dregs of the sourest scum of space, such an utterly incompetent and self-opinionated ass as you are." The outraged pirate chief, bellowing incoherently in wildly mounting rage, was leaping toward a cabinet in which were kept the delameters. "Then, in that case, the inferior keeps the red-headed wench himself. Put that on a tape, Chief, and eat it. Then, if you are too much of a lily-livered coward to do anything about it yourself, have me spread-eagled," the Lensman concluded cuttingly. Blast him down," the nurse had been shrieking. And as the raging commander neared the cabinet, no one noticed that her latest and loudest scream was, "Kim, blast him down. Don't wait any longer. Beam him down before he gets a gun." But the Lensman did not act, yet. Although almost every man of the pirate crew stared spellbound, Kinnison's enslaved observer had for many seconds been jamming the sub-ether with Helmuth's personal and urgent call. It was of almost vital importance to his plan that Helmuth himself should see the climax of this scene. Therefore, the communications officer stood immobile, while the profanely raving base commander reached the cabinet, tore it open, seized a delameter, and swung it savagely toward him. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Galactic Patrol by E. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. But Blakesley, the chief communications officer whose mind and body Kinnison was using, was already armed. Kinnison had seen to that. And as the base commander wrenched open the arms cabinet, that happened for which the Lensmen had been waiting. Helmuth's private lookout set began to draw current. That potentate himself was now looking on, and the enslaved observer had already begun to trace his beam. Therefore, as the raging commander of Boisea's pirate base swung about with raised delameter, he faced one already ablaze, and in a matter of seconds there was only a charred and smoking heap where the commander had stood. Kinnison wondered that Helmuth's cold voice was not already snapping from the speaker, but he was soon to discover the reason for that silence. Unobserved by the Lensman, one of the observers had recovered sufficiently from his shocked amazement to turn in a riot alarm to the guard room. 5 armed men answered that call on the double, stopped and glanced around. "Guards, blast Blakesley down!" Helmuth's unmistakable voice blared from his speaker. Obediently and manfully enough the 5 guards tried, and had it actually been Blakesley confronting them so defiantly, they probably would have succeeded. It was the body of the communications officer, it is true. The mind operating the muscles of that body, however, was the mind of Kimball Kinnison, Grey Lensman, the fastest man with a ray pistol old Tellus had ever produced. Keyed up, expecting the move, and with 2 delameters out and poised at hip. This was the being whom Helmuth was so nonchalantly ordering his minions to slay. Faster than any watching eye could follow, 5 bolts of lightning flicked from Blakesley's delameters. The last guard went down, his head a shriveled cinder, before a single pirate bolt could be loosed. "You see, Helmuth?" Kinnison spoke conversationally to the board, his voice dripping vitriol. "Playing it safe from a distance, and making other men pull your chestnuts out of the fire, is a very fine trick as long as it works. But when it fails to work, as now, it puts your tail right into the ringer. I, for one, have been for a long time completely fed up on taking orders from a mere voice, especially from the voice of one whose entire method of operation proves him to be the most pitifully arrant coward in the galaxy." "Observer, you other at the board," snarled Helmuth, paying no attention to Kinnison's barbed shafts. "Sound the assembly. Armed." "No use, Helmuth. He is stone deaf," Kinnison explained, voice sweetly venomous. "I am the only man in this base that you can talk to, and you won't be able to do even that very much longer." "And you really think that you can get away with this mutiny, this barefaced insubordination, this defiance of my authority?" "Sure I can. That's what I've been explaining to you. If you were here in person, or ever had been, if any of the boys had ever seen you, or had ever known you as anything except a disembodied voice, maybe I couldn't. But since nobody has ever seen your face, that gives me a chance." In his distant base, Helmuth's mind had flashed over every aspect of this unheard-of situation. He decided to play for time. Therefore, even as his hands darted to buttons here and there, he spoke. "Do you want to see my face?" he demanded. "If you do see it, no power in the galaxy—" "Skip it, Chief," sneered Kinnison. "Don't try to kid me into believing that you wouldn't kill me now, under any conditions if you possibly could. As for your face, it makes no difference whatever to me now, whether I ever see your ugly pan or not." "Well, you shall." And Helmuth's visage appeared, concentrating upon the rebellious officer a glare of such fury and such power that any ordinary man must have quailed, but not Blakesley Kinnison. "Well, not so bad at that. The guy looks almost human," Kinnison exclaimed, in the tone most carefully designed to drive even more frantic the helpless and inwardly raging pirate chieftain. "But I've got things to do. You can guess at what goes on around here from now on." And in the blaze of a delameter, Helmuth's plate, set, and eye disappeared. Kinnison had also been playing for time, and his enslaved observer had checked and rechecked this second and highly important line to Helmuth's ultra-secret base. Then, throughout the fortress, there blared out the urgent assembly call, to which the Lensmen added verbally, "This is a 100% call-out, including crews of ships in dock, as well as regular base personnel. Bring also the patrol nurses. Come as you are, and come fast. The doors of the auditorium will be locked in 5 minutes, and any man outside those doors will be given ample reason to wish that he had been on time." The auditorium was right off the control room, and was so arranged that when a partition was rolled back, the control room became its stage. All Boskonian bases were arranged thus, in order that the supervising officers at Grand Base could oversee, through their instruments upon the main panel, just such assemblies as this one was supposed to be. Every man hearing that call assumed that it came from Grand Base, and every man hurried to obey it. Kinnison rolled back the partition between the 2 rooms and watched for ray pistols, as the men came streaming into the auditorium. Ordinarily, only the guards went armed. 3 of them were left, but possibly a few of the ship's officers would be wearing their delameters. 4 or 5, 6, the captain and pilot of the battleship that had captured the nurses, and a vice-commander of another, besides the 3 guards. Knives, billies, and such did not count. "Time's up. Lock the doors. Bring the keys and the nurses up here," he ordered the 6 armed men, calling each by name. You women, take these chairs over here. You men sit there. Then, when all were seated, Kinnison touched a button, and the steel partitions slid smoothly into place. "What's coming off here?" demanded a guard. "Where's the commander? How about ground base? Look at that board." "Sit tight," Kinnison directed. "Hands on knees. I'll burn any or all of you that make a move. I've already burned the old man and 5 guards, and have put Grand Base out of the picture. Now, I want to find out just how we 7 stand." The Lensman already knew, but he was not tipping his hands. "Why we 7? "Because we are the only ones who happen to be wearing guns. Everyone else of the entire personnel is unarmed, and is now locked in the auditorium. You know how apt they are to get out until one of us lets them out." "But Helmuth, he'll have you blasted for this." "Hardly. My plans were not made yesterday. How many of you fellows are with me?" "What's your scheme?" demanded the vice commander. "To take these nurses to some patrol base and surrender. I'm sick of this whole game, and since none of them have been hurt, I figure they'll bring us a pardon and a fresh start, a light sentence at least." "Oh, so that's the reason," growled the captain. "Exactly. But I don't want anyone with me whose only thought would be to burn me down at the first opportunity." "Count me in," declared the pilot. "I've got a strong stomach, but enough of those jobbies is altogether too much. If you can wangle anything short of a life sentence for me, I'll go back. But I bloody well won't help you against the—" "Sure not. Not until we're out in space. I don't need any help here. Do you want my delameter?" "No, keep it. You won't use it on me. Anybody else?" One guard joined the pilot, standing aside. The other 4 wavered. "Time's up," Kinnison snapped. "Now, you 4 fellows, either go for your guns or else turn your backs, and do it right now." They elected to turn their backs, and Kinnison collected their weapons one by one. Having disarmed them, he again rolled back the partition and ordered them to join the wondering throng in the auditorium. He then addressed the assemblage, telling them what he had done and what he had it in mind to do. "A good many of you must be fed up on this lawless game of piracy, and anxious to resume association with decent men, if you can do so without incurring too great a punishment," he concluded. "I feel quite certain that those of us who man the hospital ship, in order to return these nurses to the patrol, will get light sentences at most. Miss McDougal is head nurse. We will ask her what she thinks." "Better than that," Mac replied clearly. "I am not merely quite certain either. I am absolutely sure that whatever men Mr. Blakesley selects for his crew will not be given any sentences at all. They will be pardoned, and will be given chances at jobs in the merchant service." "How do you know, miss?" asked one. "We're a black lot." "I know you are," she replied serenely. "I won't say how I know, but you can take my word for it that I do know." "Those of you who want to take a chance with us, line up over there," Kinnison directed, and walked rapidly down the line, reading the mind of each man in turn. Many of them he waved back into the main group, as he found thoughts of treachery or signs of inherent criminality. Those he selected were those who were really sincere in their desire to quit forever the ranks of Bosconi. Those who were in those ranks because of some press of circumstance, rather than because of a mental taint. As each man passed inspection, he armed himself from the cabinet and stood at ease before the group of women. Having selected his crew, the Lensman operated the controls that opened the exit nearest the hospital ship, blasted away the panel so that that exit could not be closed, unlocked a door, and turned to the pirates. "Vice Commander Krimsky, as senior officer you are now in command of the base," he remarked. "While I am in no sense giving you orders, there are a few matters about which you should be informed. First, I set no definite time as to when you may leave this room. I merely state that you will find it decidedly unhealthy to follow us at all closely as we go from here to the hospital ship. Second, you haven't a ship fit to take the ether, as your blast levers have all been broken off at the pivots. If your mechanics work at top speed, new ones can be put on in exactly 2 hours. Third, there is going to be a very severe earthquake in precisely 2 hours and 30 minutes, one which should make this base merely a memory." "An earthquake? Don't bluff, Blakesley. You couldn't do that. Well, perhaps not a regular earthquake, but something that will do just as well. If you think I'm bluffing, wait and find out. But common sense should give you the answer to that. I know exactly what Helmuth is doing now, whether you do or not. At first I intended to wipe you all out without warning, but I changed my mind. I decided that I would rather leave you alive, so that you could report to Helmuth exactly what happened. I wish that I could be watching him when he finds out how badly one man rooked him, and how far from foolproof his system is. But we can't have everything. Let's go, folks. As the group hurried away, Mac loitered until she was near the form of Blakesley, who was bringing up the rear. "Where are you, Kim?" she whispered urgently. "I'll join up at the next corridor. Keep further ahead, and get ready to run when we do." As they passed that corridor, a figure in gray leather, carrying an extremely heavy object, stepped out of it. Kinnison himself set his burden down, yanked a lever, and ran. As he ran, fountains of intolerable heat erupted, and cascaded from the mechanism he had left upon the floor. Just ahead of him, but at some distance behind the others, ran Blakesley and Mac. "Gosh, I'm glad to see you, Kim," she panted, as the Lensmen caught up with them and all three slowed down. "What is that thing back there?" "Nothing much, just a KG-4Z hotshot. Won't do any real damage, just melt this tunnel down so that they can't interfere with our getaway." "Then you were bluffing about the earthquake?" she asked, a shade of disappointment in her tone. "Hardly," he reproved her. "That isn't due for 2 hours and a half yet, but it'll happen on scheduled time." "How?" "You remember about the curious cat, don't you? However, no particular secret about it, I guess. 10 duodeck bombs placed where they'll do the most good, and timed for exactly simultaneous detonation. Here we are. Don't tell anybody I'm here." Aboard the vessel, Kinnison disappeared into a stateroom, while Blakesley continued in charge. Men were divided into watches, duties were assigned, inspections were made, and the ship shot into the air. There was a brief halt to pick up Kinnison's speedster, then again on the way, Blakesley turned the board over to Crandall, the pilot, and went into Kinnison's room. There the Lensman withdrew his control, leaving intact the memory of everything that had happened. For minutes Blakesley was almost in a daze, but struggled through it and held out his hand. "Mighty glad to meet you, Lensman. Thanks. All I can say is that after I got sucked in, I couldn't—" "Sure, I know all about it. That was one of the reasons I picked you out. Your subconsciousness didn't fight back a bit, at any time. You are to be in charge from here to tell us. Please go and chase everybody out of the control room except Crandall." "Say, I just thought of something," exclaimed Blakesley, when Kinnison joined the two officers at the board. "You must be that particular Lensman who's been getting in Helmuth's hair so much lately." "Probably. That's my chief aim in life." "I'd like to see Helmuth's face when he gets the report of this. I've said that before, haven't I? But I mean it now, even more than I did before." "I'm thinking of Helmuth too, but not that way." The pilot had been scowling at his plate, and now turned to Blakesley and the Lensman, glancing curiously from one to the other. "Oh, I say, a Lensman, what? A bit of good old light begins to dawn, but that can wait. Helmuth is after us. Foot, horse, and marines. Look at that plate." "4 of them already," exclaimed Blakesley. "And there's another. And we haven't got a beam hot enough to light a cigarette, nor a screen strong enough to stop a firecracker. We've got legs, but not as many as Helmuth's flyers. You knew all about that, though, of course, before we started. And from what you've pulled off so far, you've got something left on the hooks. What is it? What's the answer?" "Indetectability," replied Kinnison. "We can detect them, but they can't detect us. All you have to do is stay out of range of their electros and drill for Tellus." "That's hard to believe, but it must be true. There are 9 ships on the plates now, all Boskonians and all certainly looking for us, but not a one of them has paid any attention to us." "Nor will they. And by the way, who or what is Boskoni?" "Nobody knows. Helmuth speaks for Boskoni, and nobody else ever does, not even Boskoni himself, if there is such a person. Nobody can prove it, but everybody knows that Helmuth and Boskoni are simply 2 names for the same man. Helmuth, you know, is only a voice. Nobody ever saw his face until today. I'm beginning to think so myself. And Kinnison strode away to call at the office of head nurse McDougal. Mac, here's a small but highly important box, he told her, taking the neutralizer from his pocket and handing it to her. Put it in your locker until you get to Tellus. Then take it yourself and give it to Haynes himself in person, and to nobody else. Just tell him I sent it. He'll know all about it. But why not keep it and give it to him yourself? You're coming with us, aren't you? Probably not all the way. I imagine I'll have to shove off before we get back to Tellus. But I want to talk to you, she exclaimed. Why, I've got a million questions to ask you. That would take a long time, he grinned at her. And time is just what we don't have right now, either of us. And he strode back to the board. He labored for hours at a calculating machine and in the tank, finally to squat down upon his heels, staring at two needle-like rays of light in the tank, and whistling softly between his teeth. From those two lines, while exactly in the same plane, did not intersect in the tank at all. Estimating as carefully as he could the point of intersection of the lines, he punched the cancel key to wipe out all traces of his work and went to the chart room. Chart after chart he hauled down, and for many minutes he worked with calipers, compass, goniometer, and a carefully set adjustable triangle. Finally he marked a point, exactly upon a small plain dot already upon the chart, and again whistled. Huh, he grunted. He rechecked all his figures and retraversed the chart, only to have his needle pierce again the same tiny, unmarked dot. He stared at it for a full minute, studying the map all around his marker. Star cluster AC 257 4736, he ruminated. The smallest, most insignificant, least known star cluster he could find, and my largest possible error can't put it anywhere else. Kind of thought it might be in a cluster, but I never would have looked there. No wonder it took a lot of stuff to trace his beam. It would have to be 4 numbers Brentle harder than a diamond drill to work from there. Again whistling tunelessly to himself, he rolled up the chart upon which he'd been at work, stuck it under his arm, replaced the others in their compartments, and went back to the control room. How's tricks, fellows? He asked. QX, replied Blakesley. We're through them and into clear ether. Not a ship on the plate, and nobody gave us even a tumble. Fine. We won't have any trouble then, from here in to Prime Base. Glad of it, too. I've got a flit. That'll mean long watches for you two, but it can't very well be helped. But I say, old bird, I don't mind the watches, but... Don't worry about that either. The crew can be trusted to a man. Not one of you joined the pirates of your own free will, and not one of you has ever taken an active part. What are you, a mind reader or something? Crandall burst out. Something like that, Kinnison assented with a grin. Blakesley put in. More than that, you mean? Something like hypnosis, only more so. You think that I had something to do with this? But I didn't. The Lensman did it all himself. Crandall stared at Kinnison, new respect in his eyes. I knew that unattached Lensmen were good, but I had no idea that they were that good. No wonder Helmuth has been getting his wind up about you. I'll string along with anyone who can take a whole base single-handed, and make such a bally-ass to boot out of such a keen old bird as Helmuth is. But I'm in a bit of a dither, not to say a funk, about what is going to happen when we pop into Prime Base without you. Every man jack of us, you know, is slated for the lethal chamber without trial. Miss McDougal will do her bit, of course. What I mean is, has she enough jets to swing it? I think that she has, but to avoid all argument I've fixed that up too. Here's a tape telling all about what happened. It ends up with my recommendation for a full pardon for each of you, and for a job at whatever he is found best fitted for. It is signed with my thumbprint. Give it or send it to Port Admiral Haynes as soon as you land. I've got enough jets, I think, so that it will go as it lays. Jets, you? Right-o. You've got jets enough to lift 14 freighters off the North Pole of Valeria. What next? Stores and supplies for my speedster. I'm doing a long flit, and this ship has supplies to burn, so I'd like to have my little can loaded, plimsoll down. The speedster was stocked forthwith. Then, with nothing more than a casually waved salute in the way of farewell, Kinnison boarded his tiny spaceship and shot away toward his distant goal. Crandall, the pilot, sought his bunk, while Blakesley started his long trick at the board. In an hour or so, the head nurse strolled in. "Kim?" she queried doubtfully. "No, Miss McDougal, it's Blakesley, sorry." "Oh, I'm glad of that. That means that everything is settled. Where's the Lensman? In bed?" "He is gone, miss." "Gone? Without a word? Where?" "He didn't say. He wouldn't, of course." The nurse turned away, exclaiming inaudibly, "Gone! I'd like to cuff him for that. The big lug. Gone! Why, the great big lobsterly clunker." End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Galactic Patrol by E. E. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. But Kinnison was not heading for Helmuth's base, yet. He was splitting the ether toward Aldebaran instead, as fast as his speedster could go, and she was one of the fastest things in the galaxy. He had two good reasons for going there before he attempted Boskoni's grand base. First, to try out his skill upon non-human intellects. If he could handle the wheelmen, he was ready to take the far greater hazard. Second, he owed those wheelmen something, and he did not like to call in the whole patrol to help him pay his debts. He could, he thought, handle that base himself. Knowing exactly where it was, he had no difficulty in finding the volcanic shaft which formed the entrance to the Aldebarian base. Down that shaft his sense of perception sped. He found the lookout plates, and followed their power leads. Gently, carefully, he insinuated his mind into that of the wheelman at the board, discovering, to his great relief, that that monstrosity was no more difficult to handle than had been the Rigelian observer. Mind or intellect, he found, were not affected at all by the shape of the brains concerned. Quality, reach, and power were the essential factors. Therefore, he let himself in and took position in the same room from which he had been driven so violently. Kinnison examined with interest the wall through which he had been blown, noting that it had been repaired so perfectly that he could scarcely find the joints which had been made. These wheelmen, the Lensmen knew, had explosives, since the bullets which had torn their way through his armor and through his flesh had been propelled by that agency. Therefore, to the mind within his grasp, he suggested the place where explosives are kept, and the thought of that mind flashed to the storeroom in question. Similarly, the thought of the one who had access to that room pointed out to the Lensman the particular wheelman he wanted. It was as easy as that. And since he took care not to look at any of the weird beings, he gave no alarm. Kinnison withdrew his mind delicately, leaving no trace of its occupancy, and went to investigate the arsenal. There he found a few cases of machine rifle cartridges, and that was all. Then he went into the mind of the munitions officer, where he discovered that the heavy bombs were kept in a distant crater, so that no damage would be done by any possible explosion. "Not quite as simple as I thought," Kinnison ruminated. "But there's a way out of that, too." There was. It took an hour or so of time, and he had to control two wheelmen instead of one, but he found that he could do that. When the munitions master took out a bomb scow after a load of HE, the crew had no idea that it was anything except a routine job. The only wheelman who would have known differently, the one at the lookout board, was the other whom Kinnison had to keep under control. The scow went out, got its load, and came back. Then, while the Lensman was flying out into space, the scow dropped down the shaft. So quietly was the whole thing done that not a creature in that whole establishment knew that anything was wrong until it was too late to act. And then none of them knew anything at all. Not even the crew of the scow realized that they were dropping too fast. Kinnison didn't know what would happen if a mind, to say nothing of two of them, died while in his mental grasp, and he did not care to find out. Therefore, a fraction of a second before the crash, he jerked free and watched. The explosion and its consequences did not look at all impressive from the Lensman's point of vantage. The mountain trembled a little, then subsided noticeably. From its summit there erupted an unimportant little flare of flame, some smoke, and an insignificant shower of rock and debris. However, when the scene had cleared up, there was no longer any shaft leading downward from that crater. A floor of solid rock began almost at its lip. Nevertheless, the Lensmen explored thoroughly all the region where the stronghold had been, making sure that the cleanup had been 100% effective. Then, and only then, did he point the speedster's streamlined nose towards star cluster AC 257 4736. In his hidden retreat so far from the galaxy's crowded suns and worlds, Helmuth was in no enviable or easy frame of mind. 4 times he had declared that accursed Lensman, whoever he might be, must be destroyed, and had mustered his every available force to that end, only to have his intended prey slip from his grasp, as effortlessly as a droplet of mercury eludes the clutching fingers of a child. That Lensman, with nothing except a speedster and a bomb, had taken and had studied one of Boskoni's new battleships, thus obtaining for his patrol the secret of cosmic energy. Abandoning his own vessel, then crippled and doomed to capture or destruction, he had stolen one of the ships searching for him, and in it he had calmly sailed to Valentia, right through Helmuth's screen of blockading vessels. He had in some way so fortified Valentia as to capture 6 more Boskonian battleships. In one of those ships he had won his way back to the prime base of the patrol, with information of such immense importance that it had robbed the Boskonian organization of its then overwhelming superiority. More, he had found or had developed new items of equipment which, save for Helmuth's own success in obtaining them, would have given the patrol a definite and decisive superiority over Boskonia. Now both sides were again equal, except for that Lensman and the lens. Helmuth still quailed inwardly whenever he thought of what he had undergone at the Eurasian barrier, and he had given up all thought of securing the secret of the lens by force, or from Eurasia, but there must be other ways of getting it. And just then there came in the urgent call from Boisia II, followed by the stunningly successful revolt of the hitherto innocuous Blakesley, culminating as it did in the destruction of Helmuth's every Boisian device of vision or of communication. Blue-white with fury, the Boskonian high chief flung his net abroad to take the renegade, but as he settled back to await results, a thought struck him like a blow from a fist. Blakesley was innocuous. He never had, did not now and never would have, the cold nerve and the sheer dominating power he had just shown. Toward what conclusion did that fact point? The furious anger disappeared from Helmuth's face, as though it had been wiped therefrom with a sponge, and he became again the cold, calculating mechanism of flesh and blood that he ordinarily was. This conception changed matters entirely. This was not an ordinary revolt of an ordinary subordinate. The man had done something which he could not possibly do. So what? The lens again. Again, that accursed Lensman, the one who had somehow learned really to use his lens. Walmarth, call every vessel at Boisia Base, he directed crisply. Keep on calling them until someone answers. Get whoever is in charge there now, and put him on me here. A few minutes of silence followed. Then Vice Commander Krimsky reported in full everything that had happened, and told of the threatened destruction of the base. You have an automatic speedster there, have you not? Yes, sir. Turn over command to the next in line, with orders to move to the nearest base, taking with him as much equipment as is possible. Caution him to leave on time, however, for I very strongly suspect that it is now too late to do anything to prevent the destruction of the base. You alone, take the speedster and bring away the personnel files of the men who went with Blakesley. A speedster will meet you at a point to be designated later and relieve you of the records. An hour passed, 2, then 3. Walmark, Blakesley and the hospital ship have vanished, I presume? They have. The underling, expecting a verbal flaying, was greatly surprised at the mildness of his chief's tone and at the studious serenity of his face. Come to the center. Then, when the lieutenant was seated, I do not suppose that you as yet realize what, or rather who, it is that is doing this. Why, Blakesley is doing it, of course. I thought so too at first. That was what the one who really did it wanted us to think. It must have been Blakesley. We saw him do it, sir. How could it have been anyone else? I do not know. I do know, however, and so should you, that he could not have done it. Blakesley of himself is of no importance whatever. We'll catch him, sir, and make him talk. He can't get away. You will find that you will not catch him, and that he can get away. Blakesley alone, of course, could not do so, any more than he could have done the things he apparently did do. No, Wallmark, we are not dealing with Blakesley. Who then, sir? Haven't you deduced that yet? The Lensmen, fool! The same Lensman who's been thumbing his nose at us ever since he took one of our first-class battleships with a speedboat and a firecracker. But great blinding rockets, how? Again I admit that I do not know yet. The connection, however, is quite evident. Thought. Blakesley was thinking thoughts utterly beyond him. The lens comes from Eresia. The Eresians are masters of thought, of mental forces and processes incomprehensible to any of us. There are elements which, when fitted together, will give us the complete picture. Still, I don't see how they fit. Neither do I, yet. However, it should be clear to you that we do not want the Lensman thinking such thoughts as that into this base. We certainly do not. However, surely he can't trace... Just a moment. The time has come when it is no longer safe to say what the Lensman cannot do. Our communicator beams are hard and tight, yes. But any beam can be tapped if enough power be applied to it, and any beam that can be tapped can be traced. I expect him to visit us here, and we will be prepared for his visit. That is the reason for this conference with you. Here is a device which generates a field through which no thought can penetrate. I've had this device for some time, but for obvious reasons have not released it. Here are the diagrams and complete constructional data. Have a few hundred of them made with all possible speed, and see to it that every being on this planet wears one continuously. Impress upon everyone, and I will also, that it is of the utmost importance that absolutely continuous protection be maintained, even while changing batteries. Experts have been working for some time upon the problem of protecting the entire planet with such a screen, and there is some little hope of success in the near future. But individual protection will still be of the utmost importance. We cannot impress it too forcibly upon everyone that every man's life is dependent upon each one maintaining his thought screen in full operations at all times. That is all. When the messenger brought in the personal files of Blakesley and the other deserters, Helmuth and his psychologist went over them with minutely painstaking care. The more they studied them, the clearer it became that the chief's conclusion was the correct one. Someone had, in some way, brought an extraordinary mental pressure to bear. Reason and logic told Helmuth that the Lensman's only purpose in attacking the Boisian base was to get a line on Grand Base, that Blakesley's flight and the destruction of the base were merely diversions, to obscure the real purpose of the visit, that the Lensman had staged that theatrical performance especially to hold him, Helmuth, while his beam was being traced, and that was the only reason why the Visiset was not sooner put out of action. And finally, that the Lensman had scored another clean hit. He, Helmuth himself, had been caught flat-footed, his face hardened and his jaw set at the thought. But he had not been taken in. He was forewarned, and he would be ready, for he was coldly certain that Grand Base and he himself were the real objectives of the Lensman. That Lensman knew full well that any number of ordinary bases, ships, and men could be destroyed without damaging materially the Boskonian cause. Steps must be taken to make Grand Base as impregnable to mental forces as it already was to physical ones. Otherwise, it might well be that even Helmuth's own life would presently be at stake, and that life was a thing precious indeed. Therefore, council after council was held. Every contingency that could be thought of was brought up and discussed. Every possible precaution was taken. In short, every resource of Grand Base was devoted to the warding off of any possible mental threat which might be forthcoming. Kinnison approached that star cluster with care. Small though it was, as cosmic groups go, It yet was composed of some hundreds of stars and an unknown number of planets. Any one of those planets might be the one he sought, and to approach it unknowingly might prove disastrous. Therefore, he slowed down to a crawl and crept up, light year by light year, with his ultra-powerful detectors fanning out before him, to the limit of their unimaginable reach. He had more than half expected that he would have to search that cluster, world by world, but in that, at least, he was pleasantly disappointed. One corner of one of his plates began to show a dim glow of detection. A bell tinkled, and Kinnison directed his most powerful master plate into the region indicated. This plate, while a very narrow field, had tremendous resolving power and magnification, and in it he saw that there were 18 small centers of radiation surrounding one vastly larger one. There was no doubt, then, as to the location of Helmuth's base, but there arose the question of approach. The Lensmen had not considered the possibility of a screen of lookout ships. If they were close enough together so that their electromagnetics had even a 50% overlap, he might as well go back home. What were those outposts, and exactly how closely were they spaced? He observed, advanced, and observed again, computing finally that whatever they were so far apart that there could be no possibility of any electro-overlap at all. He could get between them easily enough. He wouldn't even have to baffle his flares. There could not be guards at all, Kinnison concluded, but must simply be outposts, set far outside the solar system of the planet they guarded, not to ward off one-man speedsters, but to warn Helmuth of the possible approach of a force large enough to threaten the grand base of Boskonia. Closer and closer Kinnison flashed, discovering that the central object was indeed a base, startling in its immensity, and completely and intensively fortified, and that the outposts were huge floating fortresses, practically stationary in space relative to the sun of the solar system they surrounded. The Lensman aimed at the center of the imaginary square, formed by 4 of the outposts, and drove in as close to the planet as he dared. Then, going inert, he set his speedster into an orbit. He did not care particularly about its shape, provided that it was not too narrow an ellipse, and cut off all his power. He was now safe from detection. Leaning back in his seat and closing his eyes, he hurled his sense of perception into and through the massed fortifications of Grand Base. For a long time he did not find a single living creature. He traversed hundreds of miles, perceiving only automatic machinery, bank after towering mile-square bank of accumulators, and remote-controlled projectors and other weapons and apparatus. Finally, however, he came to Helmuth's dome, and in that dome he received another severe shock. The personnel in that dome were to be numbered by the hundreds, but he could not make mental contact with any one of them. He could not touch their minds at all. He was stopped cold. Every member of Helmuth's band was protected by a thought screen, as effective as the Lensman's own. Around and around the planet the speedster circled, while Kinnison struggled with this new and entirely unexpected setback. This looked as though Helmuth knew what was coming. Helmuth was nobody's fool, Kinnison knew. But how could he possibly have suspected that a mental attack was in the book? Perhaps he was just playing safe. If so, the Lensman's chance would come. Men would be careless, batteries weakened, and would have to be changed. But this hope was also vain, as continued watching revealed that each battery was listed, checked, and timed. Nor was any screen released, even for an instant, when its battery was changed, the fresh power source being slipped into service before the weakening one was disconnected. Well, that proves that Helmuth knows, Kinnison cogitated, after watching vainly several such changes. He's a wise old bird. The guy really has jets. I still don't see what I did that could have put him wise to what was going on. Day after day, the Lensman studied every detail of construction, operation, and routine of that base. And finally an idea began to dawn. He shot his attention toward a barracks he had inspected frequently of late, but stopped, irresolute. Kim. Maybe better not, he advised himself. Helmut's mighty quick on the trigger to figure out that Boysian thing so fast. His projected thought was sheared off without warning, thus settling the question definitely. Helmuth's big apparatus was at work. The whole planet was screened against thought. Oh well, probably better at that, Kinnison went on arguing with himself. If I'd tried it out, maybe he'd have got onto it and laid me a stymie next time, when I really need it. Since he had accomplished everything that he could do for the time being, he went free and hurled his speedster toward Earth, now distant indeed. Several times during that long trip he was sorely tempted to call Haynes through his lens and get things started, but he always thought better of it. This was altogether too important a thing to be sent through so much sub-ether, or even to be thought about except inside an absolutely thought-tight room. And besides, every waking hour of even that long trip could be spent very profitably in digesting and correlating the information he had obtained, and in mapping out the salient features of the campaign that was to come. Therefore, before time began to drag, Kinnison landed at Prime Base and was granted instant audience with Port Admiral Haynes. "Mighty glad to see you, son." Haynes greeted the young Lensman cordially as he sealed the room thought tight. "Since you came in under your own power, I assume that you are here to make a constructive report." "Better than that, sir. I'm here to start something in a big way. I know at last where their grand base is, and have detailed plans of it. I think that I know who and where Boskonia is. I know where Helmuth is, and I've worked out a plan whereby, if it works, we can wipe out that base. Boskoni, Helmuth, and all the lesser masterminds at one wipe." "Holy jumping rockets!" For the first time since Kinnison had known him, the old man lost his poise. He leaped to his feet and seized Kinnison by the arm. "I knew you were good, but not that good. The Arisians gave you the treatments you wanted then?" "They sure did." And the younger man reported as briefly as possible everything that had happened, then outlined the plan upon which he'd been working so long. "I'm just as sure that Helmuth is Boskoni as I can be of anything that can't be proved," Kinnison declared, bending over a huge chart and sketching rapidly. "Helmuth speaks for Boskoni, and nobody else ever does, not even Boskoni himself. None of the other big shots know anything about Boskoni or ever heard him speak, but they all jump through their hoops when Helmuth, speaking for Boskoni, cracks the whip. And I couldn't get a trace of Helmuth ever taking anything up with any higher-ups. Therefore, I'm dead certain that when we get Helmuth, we get Boskoni. But that's going to be a real job of work. I scouted his headquarters from stem to gudgeon, as I told you, and Grand Base is absolutely impregnable as it stands. I never imagined anything like it. It makes Prime Base here look like a deserted crossroads after a hard winter. They've got screens, pits, projectors, accumulators, all on a gigantic scale. In fact, they've got everything. But you can get all that from the tape. I've learned definitely that we cannot take them by any possible direct frontal attack. Even if we attacked with every ship and mauler we've got throughout the galaxy, they could stand us off. And they match us ship for ship. We'd never get near that base at all if they knew that we were coming." "Well, if it's such an impossible job, what?" "I'm coming to that. It is impossible as it stands, but there's a good chance that I'll be able to soften Grand Base up. You know, like a worm, bore from within. Anyway, that's the only possible way to do it, so I've got to try it. You'll have to put detector nullifiers on every ship assigned to the job, but that'll be easy. I would suggest sending all the maulers and first-class battleships we've got. But you will, of course, work that out later. The important thing, as I gather it, is timing." "Absolutely to the minute, since I won't be able to communicate once I get inside their thought screens. How long will it take to concentrate everything we've got and put it in that cluster?" 7 weeks, 8 at the outside. +2 for allowances, QX. At exactly hour 20, 10 weeks from today, let every projector of every vessel that you can possibly get there cut loose on that base with everything they can pour in. Where's that other print? Here, 26 main objectives, you see. Blast them all simultaneously to the second. If they all go down, the rest will be possible. If not, it will be just too bad. Then work along these lines here, straight from those 26 stations to the dome, blasting everything as you go. Make it last exactly 15 minutes, not a minute more or less. If, by 15 minutes after 20, the main dome hasn't surrendered by cutting its screens, Blast that too if you can. It'll take a lot of blasting, I'm afraid. From then on, you and the fleet commander will have to do whatever is appropriate to the occasion. Your plan doesn't cover that, apparently. Where will you be? How will you be fixed, if the main dome does not cut its screens? I'll be dead, and you'll just be starting the damnedest war that this galaxy ever saw. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Galactic Patrol by E. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. While servicing and checking over the speedster required only a couple of hours, Kinnison did not leave Earth for almost 2 days. He had requisitioned much special equipment, the construction of one item of which, a suit of armor such as had never been seen upon Earth before, caused almost all of the delay. When it was ready, the greatly interested port admiral accompanied the young Lensmen out to the steel-lined, sand-filled concrete dugout, in which the suit had already been mounted upon a remote-controlled dummy. 50 feet from that dummy there was a heavy, water-cooled machine rifle, with its armored crew standing by. As the two approached, the crew leaped to attention. "As you were," Haynes instructed. "You checked those cartridges against those I brought in from Aldebaran 1?" asked Kinnison of the officer in charge, as, accompanied by the port admiral, he crouched down behind the shields of the control panel. "Yes, sir. These are 25% over, as you specified." "QX, commence firing." Then, as the weapon clamored out its stuttering, barking roar, Kinnison made the dummy stoop, turn, bend, twist, and dodge, so as to bring its every plate, joint, and member into the hail of steel. The uproar stopped. 1,000 rounds, sir," the officer reported. "No holes, no dents, not a scratch or a scar," Kinnison reported, after a minute examination, and got into the thing. "Now, give me 2,000 rounds, unless I tell you to stop. Shoot!" Again the machine rifle burst into its ear-shattering song of hate, and strong as Kinnison was, and powerfully braced by the blast of his drivers, he could not stand against the awful force of those bullets. Over he went, backward, and the firing ceased. "Keep it up," he snapped. "Think they're going to quit shooting at me because I fall down?" "But you had 1,900, protested the officer. "Keep on pecking until you run out of ammunition or until I tell you to stop," ordered Kinnison. "I've got to learn how to handle this thing under fire." The storm of metal again began to crash against the reverberating shell of steel. It hurled the Lensman down, rolled him over and over, slammed him against the backstop. Again and again he struggled upright, only to be hurled again to ground as the riflemen, really playing the game now, swung their leaden hail from part to part of the armor, and varied their attack from steady fire to short but savage bursts. But finally, in spite of everything the gun crew could do, Kinnison learned his controls. Then, drivers flaring, he faced that howling, chattering muzzle, and strode straight into the stream of smoke and flame-enshrouded steel. Now the air was literally full of metal. Bullets and fragments of bullets whined and shrieked in mad abandon as they ricocheted off that armor in all directions. Sand and bits of concrete flew hither and yon, filling the atmosphere of the dugout. The rifle yammered at maximum, with its sweating crew laboring mightily to keep its voracious maw full-fed. But in spite of everything, Kinnison held his line and advanced. He was a bare 10 feet from that raving, steel-vomiting muzzle when the firing again ceased. 20,000, sir, the officer reported crisply. "We have to change barrels before we can give you any more." "That's enough," snapped Haynes. "Come out of there." Out Kinnison came. He removed heavy earplugs, swallowed 4 times, blinked and grimaced. Finally he spoke. "It works perfectly, sir, except for the noise. It's a good thing I've got a lens. Even though I was wearing plugs, I won't be able to hear a sound for 3 days. How about the springs and shock absorbers? Are you bruised anywhere? You took some real bumps." "Perfect, not a bruise. Let's look her over." Every inch of that armor's surface was now marked by blurs, where the metal of the bullets had rubbed on the shining alloy, but that surface was neither scratched, scored, nor dented. "QX, boys. Thanks." Kinnison dismissed the riflemen. They probably wondered how any man could see through a helmet built up of inches-thick laminated alloys, with neither window nor port through which to look. But if so, they made no mention of their curiosity. They, too, were patrolmen. "Is that thing an armor or a personal tank?" asked Haines. "I aged 10 years while that was going on. But at that, I'm glad you insisted on testing it as you did. You can get away with anything now." "I've found that it is much better technique to learn things among friends here than among enemies," Kinnison laughed. "It's heavy, of course, over 300 kilos net. I won't be walking around in it much, though, and even that little I'll be flying instead of walking it. Well, sir, since everything's set, I think I'd better fly it over to the speedster and start flitting, don't you? I don't know exactly how much time I'm going to need on Trenco." "Might as well," the port admiral agreed, as casually, and Kinnison was gone. What a man! Haines stared after the monstrous figure until it vanished in the distance, then strolled slowly toward his office, thinking as he went. Nurse McDougal had been highly irked and incensed at Kinnison's casual departure, without idle conversation or formal leave-takings. Not so Haines. That seasoned campaigner knew that Grey Lensmen, particularly young Grey Lensmen, were prone to get that way. He knew, in a way she never would, and never could know, that Kinnison was no longer of Earth. He was now only of the galaxy, not of any one tiny dust grain of it. He was of the Patrol. He was the Patrol, and he was taking his new responsibilities very seriously indeed. In his fierce zeal to drive his campaign through to a successful end, he would use man or woman, singly or in groups, ships, even Prime Base itself, exactly as he had used them, as pawns, as mere tools, as means to an end. And having used them, he would leave them as unconcernedly and as unceremoniously as he would drop pliers and spanner, and with no realization that he had violated any of the nicer amenities of life as it is lived. And as he strolled along in thought, the port admiral smiled quietly to himself. He knew, as Kinnison would learn in time, that the universe was vast, that time was long, and that the scheme of things, comprising the whole of eternity and the cosmic all, was a something incomprehensibly immense indeed. With which cryptic thought, the space-hardened veteran sat down at his desk and resumed his interrupted labors. But Kinnison had not yet attained Haines' philosophic viewpoint, any more than he had his age, and to him the trip to Trenco seemed positively interminable. Eager as he was to put his plan of campaign to the test, he found that mental urgings, or even audible invectives, would not make the speedster go any faster than the already incomprehensible top speed of her driver's maximum blast. Nor did pacing up and down the little control room seem to help very much. Physical exercise he had to perform, but it did not satisfy him. Mental exercise was impossible. He could think of nothing except Helmuth's base. Eventually, however, he approached Trenco and located without difficulty the patrol's spaceport. Fortunately, it was then at about 11 o'clock, so that he did not have to wait long to land. He drove downward inert, sending a thought ahead of him. "Lensman of Trenco Spaceport, Trogonsky or his relief. Lensman Kinnison of Sol 3, asking permission to land." "It is Trogonsky," came back the thought. "Welcome, Kinnison. You are on the correct line. You have, then, perfected an apparatus to see truly in this distorting medium?" "I didn't perfect it. It was given to me." The landing bars lashed out, seized the speedster, and eased her down into the lock, and as soon as she had been disinfected, Kinnison went into consultation with Trogonsky. The Regellian was a highly important factor in the Tellurian's scheme, and since he was also a Lensman, he was to be trusted implicitly. Therefore, Kinnison told him briefly what occurred, and what he had it in mind to do, concluding, "So you see, I need about 50 kilograms of thionite, not 50 milligrams or even grams, but 50 kilograms, and since there probably isn't that much of the stuff loose in the whole galaxy, I came over here to ask you to make it for me." Just like that, calmly asking a Lensman, whose sworn duty it was to kill any being even attempting to gather a single Draconian plant, to make for him more of the prohibited drug than was ordinarily processed throughout the galaxy, during a Solarian month. It would be just such an errand were one to walk into the Treasury Department in Washington and inform the chief of the Narcotics Bureau, quite nonchalantly, that he dropped in to pick up 10 tons of heroin. But Tragonsky did not flinch or question. He was not even surprised. This was a Grey Lensman, and his plan would work. "That should not be too difficult," Tragonsky replied, after a moment's study. "We have several thionite processing units, confiscated from Zwilnik's ships, and not yet picked up by headquarters, and all of us are, of course, quite familiar with the technique of extracting and purifying the drug." He issued orders, and shortly Trenco Spaceport presented the astounding spectacle of a full crew of the Galactic Patrol, devoting its every energy to the wholehearted breaking of the one law it was supposed, most rigidly and without fear or favor, to enforce. It was a little after noon, the calmest hour of Trenco's day. The wind had died to nothing, which on that planet meant that a strong man could stand against it, could even, if he were agile as well as strong, walk about in it. Therefore, Kinnison donned his light armor, and was soon busily harvesting the purple-leaved plants, which, he had been informed, were the richest sources of thionite. He had been working for only a few minutes when one of the natives came crawling up to him, and, after ascertaining that his hard steel armor was not good to eat, drew off and observed him intently. Here was another opportunity for practice, and in a flash the Lensman availed himself of it. Having practiced for hours upon the minds of various earthly animals, he entered this mind easily enough, finding that the Draconian flat was considerably more intelligent than a dog, so much so, in fact, that the race had already developed a fairly comprehensive language. Therefore, it did not take long for the Lensman to learn to use his subject's peculiar limbs and other members, and soon the flat was working like a Trojan, and since he was ideally adapted for his wildly raging Draconian environment, he actually accomplished more than all the rest of the force combined. "It's a dirty trick I'm playing on you, fellow," Kinnison told his helper after a while. "Come on into the receiving room, and I'll see if I can square it with you." Since food was the only logical tender, Kinnison brought out from his speedster a small can of salmon, a package of cheese, a bar of chocolate, a few lumps of sugar, and a potato, offering them to the Draconian in order. The salmon and the cheese were both highly acceptable fare. The morsel of chocolate was a delightfully surprising delicacy. The lump of sugar, however, was what really rang the bell. Kinnison's own mind felt the shock of pure ecstasy as that wonderful substance dissolved in the Trenco's mouth. He also ate the potato, of course. Any Draconian animal will, at any time, eat anything containing carbon, even lime rock, gasoline, or truck grease. But it was merely food, nothing to rave about. Knowing now what to do, Kinnison led his assistant out into the howling, shrieking gale, and released him from control, throwing a lump of sugar upwind as he did so. The Trenco seized it in the air, ate it, and went into a very hysteria of joy. "More! More!" he insisted, attempting to climb up the Lensman's armored leg. "You must work for more of it if you want it," Kinnison explained. "Break off these plants here and carry them over into that empty thing over there, and you get more." This was an entirely new idea to the native, but after Kinnison had taken hold of his mind and had shown him how to do consciously that which he had been doing unconsciously for an hour, he worked willingly enough. In fact, before it started to rain, therefore putting an end to the labor of the day, there were a dozen of them toiling at the harvest, and the crop was coming in as fast as the entire crew of Regellians could process it. And even after the spaceport was sealed, they crowded up, paying no attention to the rain, bringing in their small loads of leaves, and plaintively asking admittance. It took some little time for Kinnison to make them understand that the day's work was done, and that they were to come back tomorrow morning. Finally, however, he succeeded in getting the idea across, and the last disconsolate turtle man went reluctantly away. But sure enough, next morning, even before the mud had dried, the same 12 were back on the job. The two Lensmen wondered simultaneously how these Trencos could have found the spaceport, or had they stayed near it through the storm and flood of the night. "I don't know," Kinnison answered the unasked question, "but I can find out." Again and more carefully, he examined the minds of 2 or 3 of them. "No, they didn't follow us," he reported then. "They're not as dumb as I thought they were. They have a sense of perception. Tragonsky, about the same thing, I judge, as yours. Perhaps even more so. I wonder, why couldn't they be trained into mighty efficient police assistants on this planet?" "The way you handle them, yes. I can converse with them a little, of course, but they have never before shown any willingness to cooperate with us." "You never fed them sugar," Kinnison laughed. "You have sugar, of course, or do you? I was forgetting that many races do not use it at all." "We Regellians are one of those races. Starch is so much tastier and so much better adapted to our body chemistry that sugar is only used as a chemical. We can, however, obtain it easily enough. But there's something else. You can tell these Trencos what to do and make them really understand you. I cannot. I can fix that up with a simple mental treatment that I can give you in 5 minutes. Also, I can let you have enough sugar to carry on with until you can get in a supply of your own." In the few minutes during which the Lensmen had been discussing their potential allies, the mud had dried, and the amazing coverage of dense, succulent grass was springing visibly into being. So incredibly rapid was its growth, that in 10 minutes more the plants were large enough to be gathered. The leaves were lush and rank, in color a vivid crimsonish purple. "These early morning plants are the richest of any in thionite, but the Zwilniks can never get more than a handful of them because of the wind," remarked the Regellian. "Now, if you will give me that treatment, I will see what I can do with the flats." Kinnison did so, and the Trencos worked for Tragonsky as industriously as they had for Kinnison, and ate his sugar as rapturously. "That is enough," decided the Regellian presently. "This will finish your 50 kilograms, and to spare." He then paid off his now enthusiastic helpers, with instructions to return when the sun was directly overhead, for more work and more sugar, and this time they did not complain, nor did they loiter around or bring in unwanted vegetation. They were learning fast. Well before noon, the last kilogram of impalpable purplish-blue powder was put into its impermeable sack. The machinery was cleaned, the untouched leaves, the waste, and the contaminated air were blown out of the spaceport, and the room and its occupants were sprayed with anti-thionite. Then, and only then, did the crew remove their masks and air filters. Trenco Spaceport was again a patrol post, no longer a Zwilnik's paradise. "Thanks, Tragonsky, and all you fellows." Kinnison paused, then went on dubiously. "I don't suppose that you will—" "We will not," declared Tragonsky. "Our time is yours, as you know, without payment, and time is all that we gave you, really." "Sure, that and about 1,000 million credits worth of thionite." "That, of course, does not count, as you also know. You've helped us, I think, even more than we've helped you. I hope that I've done you some good anyway. Well, I've got to flit. Thanks again. I'll see you sometime, maybe." And again the Tellurian Lensman was on his way. End of chapter 23. Chapter 24 of Galactic Patrol by E. E. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. Kinnison approached star cluster AC 2574736 warily, as before. And as before, he insinuated his speedster through the loose outer cordon of guardian fortresses. This time, however, he did not steer even remotely near Helmuth's world. He would be there too long. There was altogether too much risk of electromagnetic detection to set his ship into any kind of an orbit around that planet. Instead, he had computed a long, narrow, elliptical orbit around its sun, well inside the zone guarded by the Maulers. He could compute it only approximately, of course, since he did not know exactly either the masses involved or the perturbing forces, but he thought that he could find his ship again with an electro. If not, she would not be an irreplaceable loss. He set the speedster, then, into the outward leg of that orbit, and took off in his new armor. He knew that there was a thought screen around Helmuth's planet, and suspected that there might be other screens as well. Therefore, shutting off every watt of power, he dropped straight down into the night side, well clear of the citadel's edge. His flares were, of course, heavily baffled, but even so he did not put on his brakes until it was absolutely necessary. He landed heavily, then sprang away in long free hops until he reached his previously selected destination, a great cavern thickly shielded with iron ore and fully 5,000 miles from his point of descent. Deep within that cavern he hid himself, then searched intently for any sign that his approach had been observed. There was no such sign. So far, so good. But during his search he had perceived with a slight shock that Helmuth had tightened his defenses even more. Not only was every man in the dome screened against thought, but also each was now wearing full armor. Had he protected the dogs, too, or killed them? No real matter if he had. Any kind of a pet animal would do, or in a pinch, even a wild rock lizard. Nevertheless, he shot his perception into the particular barracks he had noted so long before, and found with some relief that the dogs were still there, and that they were still unprotected. It had not occurred, even to Helmuth's cautious mind, that a dog could be a source of mental danger. With all due precaution against getting even a single grain of the stuff in his own system, Kinnison transferred his thionite into the special container in which it was to be used. Another day sufficed to observe and to memorize the personnel of the Gateway Observers, their positions, and the sequence in which they took the boards. Then the Lensmen, still almost a week ahead of schedule, settled down to await the time when he should make his next move. Nor was this waiting unduly irksome. Now that everything was ready, he could be as patient as a cat on duty at a mouse hole. The time came to act. Kinnison took over the mind of the dog, which at once moved over to the bunk in which one particular observer lay asleep. There would be no chance whatever of gaining control of any observer while he was actually on the board, but here in barracks it was almost ridiculously easy. The dog crept along on soundless paws. A long, slim nose reached out and up. Sharp teeth closed delicately upon a battery lead. Out came the plug. The thought screen went down, and instantly Kinnison was in charge of the fellow's mind. And when that observer went on duty, his first act was to admit Kimball Kinnison, Grey Lensman, to the grand base of Boskonians. Low and fast Kinnison flew, while the observer so placed his body as to shield from any chance passer-by the all-too-revealing surface of his visiplate. In a few minutes the Lensman reached a portal of the dome itself. Those doors also opened and closed behind him. He released the mind of the observer and watched briefly. Nothing happened. All was still well. Then, in every barracks save one, using whatever came to hand in the way of dog or unshielded animal, Kinnison wrought briefly but effectively. He did not slay by mental force. He did not have enough of that to spare, but the mere turn of an inconspicuous valve would do just as well. Some of those now idle men would probably live to answer Helmuth's call to extra duty, but not too many, nor would those who obeyed that summons live long thereafter. Down stairway after stairway he dived, down to the compartment in which was housed the great air purifier. Now let them come. Even if they had a spy ray on him, now it would be too late to do them a bit of good. And now, by all the gods of space, that fleet had better be out there, getting ready to blast. It was. From all over the galaxy, that grand fleet had been assembled. Every patrol base had been stripped of almost everything mobile that could throw a beam. Every vessel carried either a Lensman or some other highly trusted officer, and each such officer had 2 detector nullifiers, one upon his person, the other in his locker, either one of which would protect his whole ship from detection. In long lines, singly and at intervals, those untold thousands of ships had crept between the vessels guarding Grand Base. Nor were the outpost crews to blame. They had been on duty for months, and not even an asteroid had relieved the monotony. Nothing had happened, or would. They watched their plates steadily enough, and if they did nothing more, why should they? And what could they have done? How could they suspect that such a thing as a detector nullifier had been invented? The patrol's grand fleet, then, was already massing over its primary objectives, each vessel in a rigidly assigned position. The pilots, captains, and navigators were chatting amongst themselves, jerkily and in low voices, as though even to raise their voices might reveal prematurely to the enemy the concentration of the patrol forces. The firing officers were already at their boards, eyeing hungrily the small switches, which they could not throw for so many long minutes yet. And far below, beside the pirate's air purifier, Kinnison released the locking toggles of his armor and leaped out. To burn a hole in the primary duct took only a second. To drop into that duct his container of thionite, to drench that container with the reagent, which would in 60 seconds dissolve completely that container's substance, without affecting either its contents or the metal of the duct, to slap a flexible adhesive patch over the hole in the duct, and to leap back into his armor. All these things required only a trifle over 1 minute. 11 minutes to go. QX. Then, in the last barracks, even while the Lensman was arrowing up the stairways, a dog again deprived a sleeping man of his thought screen. That man, however, instead of going to work, took up a pair of pliers and proceeded to cut the battery leads of every sleeper in the barracks, severing them so close that no connection could be made without removing the armor. As those leads were severed, men woke up and dashed into the dome. Along catwalk after catwalk they raced, and apparently that was all that they were doing. But each runner, as he passed a man on duty, flicked a battery plug out of its socket, and that observer at Kinnison's command opened the faceplate of his armor and breathed deeply of the now drug-laden atmosphere. Thionite, as has been intimated, is perhaps the worst of all known habit-forming drugs. In almost infinitesimal doses, it gives rise to a state in which the victim seems actually to experience the gratification of his every desire, whatever that desire may be. The larger the dose, the more intense the sensation, until, and very quickly, the dosage is reached at which he passes into such an ecstatic stupor that not even a single nerve can force a stimulus into his frenzied brain. In this stage, he dies. Thus, there was no alarm, no outcry, no warning. Each observer sat or stood entranced, holding exactly the pose he had been in at the instant of opening his faceplate. But now, instead of paying attention to his duty, he was plunging deeper and deeper into the paroxysmally ecstatic profundity of a thionite debauch, from which there was to be no awakening. Therefore, half of that mighty dome was unmanned, before Helmuth even realized that anything at all out of order was going on. As soon as he realized that something was amiss, however, he sounded the all-hands-on-duty alarm and rapped out instructions to the officers in the barracks. But the cloud of death had arrived there first, and to his consternation not 1/4 of those officers responded. Quite a number of men did get into the dome, but every one of them collapsed before reaching the catwalks, and 3/4 of his working force were hors de combat before he located Kinnison's speeding messengers. "Blast them down!" Helmuth shrieked, pointing, gesticulating madly. "Blast whom down?" The minions of the Lensmen were themselves blasting away now, right and left, shouting contradictory but supposedly authoritative orders. "Blast those men not on duty!" Helmuth's raging voice now filled the dome. "You, at board 479, blast that man on catwalk 28, at board 495. With such detailed instructions, Kinnison's agents one by one ceased to be. But as one was beamed down, another took his place, and soon every one of the few remaining living pirates in the dome was blasting indiscriminately at every other one. And then, to cap the Saturnalian climax, came the 02nd. The grand fleet of the Galactic Patrol had assembled. Every cruiser, every battleship, every mauler, hung poised above its assigned target. Every vessel was stripped for action. Every accumulator cell was full to its ultimate watt. Every generator and every arm was tuned and peaked to its highest attainable efficiency. Every firing officer upon every ship sat tensely at his board, his hand hovering near, but not touching, his firing keys, his eyes fixed glaringly upon the second hand of his synchronized electric timer, his ears scarcely hearing the droning, soothing voice of Port Admiral Haynes. For the old man had insisted upon giving the firing order himself, and he now sat at the master timer, speaking into the master microphone. Beside him sat von Hohendorf, the grand old commandant of cadets. Both of these veterans had thought long since that they were done with space war forever, but only an order of the full Galactic Council could have kept either of them at home. They were grimly determined that they were going to be in at the death, even though they were not at all certain whose death it was to be. If it should turn out that it was Helmuth's, all well and good. Everything would be on the green. If, on the other hand, young Kinnison had to go, they would, in all probability, have to go too, and so be it. Now remember, boys, keep your hands off those keys until I give you the word. Haynes' soothing voice droned on, giving no hint of the terrific strain he himself was under. I'll give you lots of warning. I'm going to count the last 5 seconds for you. I know that you all want to shoot the first bolt, but remember that I, personally, will strangle any and every one of you who beats my signal by 1,000th of a second. It won't be long now. The second hand is starting around on its last lap. Keep your hands off those keys. Keep away from them, I tell you, or I'll smack you down. 15 seconds yet. Stay away, boys. Let them alone. Going to start counting now. His voice dropped lower and lower. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, fire! He yelled. Perhaps some of the boys did beat the gun a trifle, but not many or much. To all intents and purposes, it was one simultaneous blast of destruction that flashed down from 100,000 projectors, each delivering the maximum blast of which it was capable. There was no thought now of service life, of equipment, or of holding anything back for a later effort. They had to hold that blast for only 15 minutes, and if the task ahead of them could not be done in those 15 minutes, it probably could not be done at all. Therefore, it is entirely useless even to attempt to describe what happened then, or to portray the spectacle that ensued when beam met screen. Why try to describe high C to a man born deaf? Suffice it to say that those patrol beams bore down, and that Helmuth's automatic screens resisted to the limit of their ability. Nor was that resistance small. It was of such power that years later, astronomers observed and recorded a peculiarly behaving nova in star cluster AC 2574736. Had Helmuth's customary staff of keen-eyed, quick-witted lieutenants been at their posts, to reinforce those primary screens with the practically unlimited power which could have been put behind them, his defenses would not have failed, even under the unimaginable force of that titanic thrust. But those lieutenants were not at their posts. The screens of the 26 primary objectives failed, and the 26 stupendous flotillas moved slowly, grandly, voraciously, each along its designated line. Every alarm in Helmuth's dome had burst into frantic warning as the massed might of the Galactic Patrol was first hurled against the 26 vital points of Grand Base. But those alarms clamored in vain. No hands were raised to the switches whose closing would unleash the hellish energies of Boskonians' irresistible projectors. No eyes were upon the sighting devices which would align them against the attacking ships of war. Only Helmuth, in his inner shielded control compartment, was left. And Helmuth was the directing intelligence, the mastermind, not a mere operator. And now that he had no operators to direct, he was utterly helpless. He could see the stupendous fleet of the patrol. He could understand fully its dire menace, but he could neither stiffen his screens nor energize a single beam. He could only sit, grinding his teeth in helpless fury, and watch the destruction of the armament which, if it could only have been in operation, would have blasted those battleships and maulers from the skies, as though they had been so many fluffy bits of thistledown. Time after time he leaped to his feet, as if about to dash across to one of the control stations, but each time he sank back into his seat at the desk. One firing station would be little if any better than none at all. Besides, that accursed Lensman was back of this. He must be, right here in the dome somewhere. He wanted him to leave this desk. That was what he was waiting for. As long as he stayed at the desk, he himself was safe. For that matter, the whole dome was safe. The projector had never been mounted that could break down those screens. No matter what happened, he would stay at the desk. Kinnison, watching, marveled at his fortitude. He himself could not have stayed there, he knew, and he also knew that Helmuth was going to stay. Time was flying. 5 of the 15 minutes were gone. He had hoped that Helmuth would leave that well-protected inner sanctum, with its unknown potentialities, but if the pirate would not come out, the Lensmen would go in. The storming of that inner stronghold was what his new armor had been designed for. In he went, but he did not catch Helmuth napping. Even before he crashed the screens, his own defensive zones burst into furiously caressant activity, and through that flame there came tearing the metallic slugs of a high-caliber machine rifle. Ha! There was a rifle, even though he had not been able to find it. Clever guy, that Helmuth. And what a break that he had taken the time to learn how to hold this suit up against the trickiest kind of machine rifle fire. Kinnison's screens were almost those of a battleship, his armor almost relatively as strong, and he could hold that armor upright. Therefore, through the raging beam of the semi-portable projector he plowed, and straight up that torrent of raging steel he drove his way. And now, from his own mighty projector, against Helmuth's armor, there raved out a beam scarcely less potent than that of a semi-portable. The Lensman's armor did not mount a water-cooled machine rifle. There was a limit to what even that powerful structure could carry. But grimly, with every faculty of his newly enlarged mind concentrated upon that thought-screened, armored head behind the belching gun, Kinnison held his line and forged ahead. Well it was that the Lensman was concentrating upon that screened head, for when the screen weakened slightly and a thought began to seep through it toward an enigmatically sparkling ball of force, Kinnison was ready. He blanketed the thought savagely before it could take form, and attacked the screen so viciously that Helmuth had either to restore full coverage instantly or die then and there. For the Lensman had studied that ball long and earnestly. It was the one thing about that whole base that he could not understand, the one thing, therefore, of which he had been uneasily afraid. But he was afraid of it no longer. It was operated, he now knew, by thought, and no matter how terrific its potentialities might be, it now was and would remain perfectly harmless, for if the pirate chief softened his screen enough to admit a thought, he would never think again. Therefore, Kinnison rushed. At full blast he hurled the rifle and crashed full against the armored figure behind it. Magnetic clamps locked and held, and driving projectors furiously ablaze, he whirled around and forced the madly struggling Helmuth back, toward the line along which the bellowing rifle was still spewing forth a continuous storm of metal. Helmuth's utmost efforts sufficed only to throw the Lensman out of balance, and both figures crashed to the floor. Now the madly fighting armored pair rolled over and over, straight into the line of fire. First Kinnison, the bullets whining, shrieking off the armor of his personal battleship, and crashing through her, smashing ringingly against whatever happened to be in the ever-changing line of ricochet. Then Helmuth, and the fierce-driven metal slugs tore in their multitudes through his armor and through his body, riddling his every vital organ. End of chapter 24. Read by Harley James. End of Galactic Patrol by E. E. Smith.